Hey, welcome to the Acme Security Systems Security Network Analysis Intelligence Log, otherwise known as the SNAIL Report. The daily briefing today is for April 17th, the 24-hour period ending at noon on the 17th. My name is Justin Royston, and welcome. First of all, a little disclaimer here. We've got this daily security brief is provided as is. No team of analysts could possibly predict every single threat or every single vulnerability. And this is no more true than for their zero-day threats. So it's best advised to use all sources of information available, and in the end, you are making the decision. You need to make the right decision for the business. So this information is provided as a tool for you to be able to make wise decisions in regard to the IT infrastructure and the systems. And this information is being provided for informational purposes only. This brief in its entirety and portions of this brief are not to be released outside of corporate operations without written approval from the legal department. Let's take a look in general here. We've got this SNAIL data report covering a 24-hour period ending in noon on the 17th of April, 2020. These are the top 3 identified as the most critical to Acme Security Systems specifically, and it is amplified by the current telework requirements and situations that we're all facing due to COVID-19 and the restrictions on going to work these days. So the biggest infrastructure announcement that we've seen is the network time protocol daemon vulnerability bug. It actually, funny enough, was a bug that was found in a patch to another bug. So that's funny. But then the next one we're going to cover is the Dockerized implementation of Jitsi Meet, which obviously Jitsi Meet is a teleconferencing, video conferencing, video platform that you can use, and that Acme Security does use for its employees. So obviously we want to hit up that vulnerability and patch that as quickly as possible. The other one is a Cisco IP phone web service. Now, every Cisco IPv phone has the ability to have a web server on it that the administrator can log into and change configuration settings and check the bandwidth and other things on it. So this vulnerability is a remote code execution flaw, and it's been patched, so that's great news. So this is the top 3 we're just covering in the summary. There's actually a couple more that we'll hit up that are important for Acme as well, but we'll start there. So let's head this off with the NTP daemon bug. Time synchronization is very vital to authentication. Without being able to synchronize times, you just can't guarantee who you're talking to. This is evident in the RSA tokens, where it changes a little 6-digit code that you get every 30 seconds or whatever the time period is. So that's just one example that you could see. But time synchronization has long been a valuable way to synchronize cryptography for decades. So having a well-synchronized clock on the system and a system time properly set is vital to having proper authentication. Failure or a denial of service attack against NTP can cause all kinds of havoc in all kinds of systems, and no more so apparent than in authentication failures. The NTP client, if it's configured in an unauthenticated way to only have one unauthenticated time source, it can be attacked in such a way that it causes the victim's next attempt to be delayed, and it can be delayed long enough so that way you can become out of sync, and as long as that attack is maintained, you can fail to synchronize, and if your system clock drifts, which they all do, then you're going to have all kinds of issues with authentication. The versions currently impacted are NTP 4.2.8 patch 12 and possibly earlier ones. They haven't fully investigated those to see how far back that problem happens. They suspect that it was introduced in a certain bug that was recently released in that patch 12, but it's suspected that they were also vulnerable before, and this bug just amplified it. So it's also in patch 13. They didn't fix it yet, and 4.3.98. basically anything prior to 4.3.100 on the 4.3 level. So obviously the fix on that is to update to 4.3.100, or you can go ahead and, if you're still stuck for some reason on 4.2, you can update to 4.2.8 patch 14, and that will patch this bug, this particular vulnerability. So if you have a system that cannot go to the later 4.3, you can patch it there. The CVSS severity level on this one is 5.9, so almost 6. So it's a medium. It's a medium. Not that super critical as far as they're concerned, but from our perspective, it's pretty critical. So I would suggest that all system administrators immediately patch this and bring their systems up to date. One mitigation technique is, if you cannot patch this system this month, then you can force authentication during your synchronization for your network time protocol. So that is an option for you as well if you really cannot switch or update at this time. And that can be pushed out by certain Microsoft services. You can update the settings on that to require authentication. So there's a couple links here for you, obviously to the ntp.org. You've got support. They've got some technical details on the bug, and the code is actually available at Bugzilla at Red Hat. You can see some of the more detailed input if you're really curious about what they did and how they fixed it. And obviously NIST.gov has a lot of good details, including some ways to implement a hack against it. So please be encouraged to check those out. This is the Dockerized version of Jitsi Meet. Jitsi Meet's a very popular video teleconferencing system that's used, and Acme Security Systems does, in fact, use it ourselves. So we have the Dockerized version of it, which is just easier to implement, easier to scale, easier to patch, easier to use. So the Dockerized version of it is running on our servers in AWS Cloud, so that is important for us to go through ahead and patch this. Apparently, some of the systems services that are installed when you Dockerize this and install the Dockerized version of it, it uses default passwords for those system accounts, which is obviously bad practice. Not sure how that even slipped through in the first place. Some quality assurance issues going on at Jitsi Meet for that one to slip through. Users or system administrators or implementers who implemented Dockerized version of Jitsi Meet and didn't change those default passwords are at risk because those default passwords are publicly available. So they're at risk of getting an authentication system circumvented by an attacker using that system account with the default password. So that would allow a remote attacker to gain access, privileged access, to that Docker container. And most Docker containers are run by a system account. So that can lead to other problems if your Docker daemon is not configured properly. You could reach some kind of breach in the Docker daemon and the protocols there that kind of do the sandboxing, which could lead to potential vulnerabilities coming out there, attacking your system and getting privileged access on the host itself, which is not what you want. So the versions impacted by this are the stable 4384 and prior. Obviously, the upgrade to 4.4384.1 stable is the fix for that. There is no CVSS severity released yet, but obviously privileged access to the host is pretty severe. So let's go ahead and patch this one up as quick as we can. Being that it's Dockerized, it's pretty easy to just implement a new change overnight when the system usage is a lot lower, and just kind of update the containers as you can. The mitigation for this, if you cannot upgrade to the latest version, is just to change those default system passwords. It's a lot more complicated than it might seem, though. You're probably better off just upgrading to the new version when you upgrade your next container. Let's go ahead and look at the snail trail for more information for the CVE 2020 11.87.8. And got some GitHub. The code is there. Jitsi Meet, Dockerized version of Jitsi Meet is there on GitHub. So you can go ahead and look at the changelog there and see what they did to implement that fix there. You can also compare. I've got a link there that lets you compare the changes between the two. and then of course the NIST.gov CVE detail. So let's move on to the Cisco IP phone situation here. So apparently every Cisco IP phone, for those who have needed to configure them and update the settings on them or patch them or do any more administrative type functions on them, you'll notice that there's a web server built in to be able to do that. Much like a lot of printers these days, they have a little web interface that you can connect to check the toner levels or whatever. So Cisco IP phones have this same feature. Well, not exactly the same, but they have a web server running on them. And there's a vulnerability in this web server that could allow an unauthenticated remote attacker. So that's pretty bad. Unauthenticated. That means that they're not using a password or anything. They're not brute forcing. They're just completely unauthenticated. They can just hit your web server and do this exploit. So can execute code with root privileges, so not a big deal really, on the device or cause a denial of service attack. And this was recorded by someone at Tenable, Jacob Baines. Thank you very much for releasing this info for us. The version impacted is 7.11 in the CVE. That's what it's listed at. But actually, when you look into it in more detail, it really varies by which model of IP phone that you're using from Cisco. So the version is not completely accurate in their reports. But the CVSS severity level is one of the highest that I've seen for a while, 9.8 critical. So obviously, having a compromised Internet of Things device on your network can be pretty severe. Definitely severe for the IP phone. I mean, you can use this to get root privileges and then install a listening device on it that forwards every conversation off to another site in, I don't know, China, wherever. So it's very important for us to go ahead and update all of our IP phones, whatever model we have, to the latest version that Cisco's released. The version number will obviously vary by model, but you need to update to the latest one that's available. That will cause this patch to be applied. If you cannot, for some reason, update your Cisco IPv phone, you've got some very important meetings coming up in the next couple of days, and you don't want to risk bricking it, then at least disable the web access feature on the device, and that will mitigate the problem until you're able to apply the latest patches. I do recommend that you do those patches as soon as possible. All right. Let's go ahead and look at the snail trail for this one. We've got CVE 2020-3161, which was issued to Cisco. I've got a couple of links on here about the flaw and how to exploit it. So Packet Storm Security's got some good stuff on how to do the denial of service, and you've got some other articles there. The Tenable.com one is the release from Tenable and the gentleman Jacob who released that. So obviously the NIST.gov, you've got the listing there with some more details as well. But these other websites have a lot more in-depth stuff. The NIST one is just a generalization. Good info, though, on it. All right, Google Chrome. Everybody's using Chrome these days. If you're not using the Edge browser, I don't know why you would. But anyway, Google Chrome has a vulnerability in it that's pretty severe, mainly because Google has stated that the complexity to make this attack happen is really low. So it's really not complex. It's really easy for a script kiddie or for someone else to do this attack. So that's part of the reason why it's viewed as Google as critical. So Google Chrome is one of the most popular browsers out there. Between Firefox and Edge currently has a pretty high ranking because it just comes as default on all Windows machines. But as more people are teleworking, the browsers are becoming a more critical part of that. Some of the other vulnerabilities that we just discussed about Jitsi Meet uses the browser to do that teleconferencing and video communications and collaboration. So using the Google Chrome browser, in addition to the Jitsi Meet, you've got two vulnerabilities there if you don't patch them. This is a use after free issue from the speech recognition component in Chrome. So a use after free uses any freed up memory that the software might have been using to do a remote code execution. And this can lead to privileged access on the system running the browser. So that's obviously a big deal. Google has stated that it's very low complexity, so this is a critical flaw according to them. Versions that are impacted, 81 and prior. 81 and prior. So you need to upgrade to the latest version greater than 81, and that will fix this problem. CVSS severity has not yet been released. Google does, as I said, self-identify this as a critical vulnerability. Obviously, gaining privileged access in a very low complexity way is pretty critical. I would have to say that might even hit them up as a 10 out of 10. The mitigation, if you cannot upgrade for some reason, which I don't know why you couldn't, but if you can't for some reason upgrade your browser, you can disable the speech recognition component of the browser. Or you can just switch over to Firefox because they're not currently having to deal with this issue right now. So, and you can use those two mitigations until you can have time to do the patching, which it's really easy to patch. Just go to Help About and it'll update. Not a big deal, really. All right, let's go ahead and look at the snail trail on this one. We've got CVE 2020 6457 and Forbes. This one hit Forbes. Pretty big time when you hit Forbes. But everybody is using Google Chrome. Everybody, especially now that everybody's teleworking and working from home and working remotely, and connecting with servers and connecting with each other. So Google Blog has a little update there explaining on their stable channel, explaining what the patch is. And then, of course, NIST.gov has a pretty good detailed explanation of what the vulnerability is. I didn't see a lot of exploits in the wild. This is a relatively new one, so it's a good time to get the patch in now before we get hit by something. We've got this one, which Android kernel. This is going to be important for our mobile division to hit right away. Any phones that we have given out to employees, company phones, are going to need to be patched. This hits every Android device that has a Qualcomm chipset, which is pretty much most of them. That includes a lot of Internet of Things devices, smartwatches. A lot of the Samsung products are hit by this, so it's really important to get the vendor updates on these and get them patched. There's two vulnerabilities that actually are combined, and it will lead to privileged access on the Android device. So that can obviously cause all kinds of problems. We do use a VPN on our systems, but with privileged access, that can be piped off, and another VPN could even be installed, potentially stealing our valuable corporate data. So let's get these patched. This includes both consumer and industrial Internet of Things devices. So any of our warehouses that are using any Android kernel and Qualcomm chipset sets will also need to be updated or disabled until we can get the patch done for them, or until the vendor releases a patch. Sometimes those warehouse devices, the patching on them is not very expedient, so we might need to give them a call and get that kicked up, or replace those devices if they're not willing to upgrade their security on those systems. A lot of the major phones right now, LG, Samsung, are using these Qualcomm chipsets, and they're vulnerable to this. Also, interestingly enough, some automobiles using Android for their heads-up display or for their little touchscreen dash system. They're vulnerable to this as well. So it's really important. CVSS severity rating is high, 7.8, almost an 8. That's pretty significant. The versions impacted are pretty much every Android kernel that's using the Qualcomm chipset. So get those latest updates that just came out after the 17th, and you should be good. The version number is going to vary by model, which is why I wasn't able to list it here. Obviously, each different implementation is going to vary. Part of the mitigations is this has to be done through an app that's installed on the phone. So do not install any unauthorized apps. Remove any unauthorized apps that may be existing on company devices, vehicles, and/or equipment. That will help to mitigate the issue until you can update things. But obviously, people should not be installing unauthorized apps on company devices anyway. Things happen. So let's be safe out there and remove those and get these phones patched up and devices patched up. Snail trail for this one. I looked at some of these. They were some pretty interesting hacks, especially the the ZDNet article. I found it pretty interesting. There were a couple of other CVEs that they could exploit in addition to these if they hadn't been patched. That would just keep kind of snowballing the effect here and making it more and more vulnerable. Although getting privileged access on a device is pretty much all that you need. To do anything else that you want on the device. Some of these other CVEs allowed you to do things in a more expedient way and not having to build yourself up an attack portfolio. So we've got the GitHub patches listed there. This gentleman, Tamriz, released the information on this. This is from a year ago, but some of these systems had not been patched, and they're just now releasing the patches for them. And the 17th is when it was announced that these patches were available. So that's why it shows up on the report, even though these CVEs are 2019. That's just when the initial vulnerability was discovered. It wasn't fully disclosed, giving manufacturers time to patch their operating system and patch their kernels. So always want to keep your kernels patched. That's important. Let's see. That's going to wrap it up for today's SNAIL report. It's been a productive day. We've had a lot of vulnerabilities hit us, so let's get out there and get patching.